cricket stars are authentically Indian despite their ability to pass as global transnational citizens with their remarkable entrepreneurial instincts and individualism. Their career success and their gendered bodies perfected through beauty products, bodybuilding and workout regimens constitute the model for an ideal man and ideal woman. So what the market is doing, what the media is doing, and so am I audible? Hello?
Audible, audible.
Okay, fine. Yeah. So both the beauty products, bodybuilding, and workout regimens constitute the model for an ideal man and ideal woman. The difference lies in the fact that beauty queens are simultaneously an embodiment of social service and maternal values, while male cricket stars' bodies are not articulated through social service and welfare. Their sportsman masculinity does not need these markers articulated through social service and welfare. This is reserved for femininity. As both beauty queens and cricket stars bring pride to the nation, they represent the ideal model of classed masculinity and classed femininity. In the symbolic and material reinstitution of heterosexuality within the market and state discourses, where does the nation situate non-heterosexual subjects and those abjected heterosexual like sex workers who fail the ideal moral gendered script of the nation? It appears that hegemonic heterosexualization of 1990s through beauty pageants and cricket stars fit well with the nationalist sexual politics as well as with transnational capitalist expansion. However, it is important to ask what compelled the nation state to also engage with abjected sexualities like the homosexuals, politicized as sexual minorities in the context of HIV/AIDS pandemic scare, raising its ugly head and emerging concerns of hegemonic humanitarian West towards the Third World. The third world are imagined as moral material geographies, housing and spreading diseases in a world becoming one through deregulation and trade liberalization, lifting restrictions on movements of capital, goods, and people. The World Bank facilitated the formation of National AIDS Control Organization (NACO) in India under the shade of international development and health in privatizing India, identity behavior categorization that posed a threat to moral and sexual health of the nation as a real and potential carrier of HIV/AIDS included commercial sex workers, drug users, migrants, and homosexuals, including the newly imported category of MSM, men who have sex with men. So Suparna Bhaskaran says the category of MSM heightened the visibility of debates regarding homosexuality, Indian gay, sexual rights, anti-sodomy statutes, modern Indian identity formation, indigenous sexual fluidity, and political advocacy. So both heterosexualization and politicization of non-heterosexual subjects have certain transnational linkages, but the state engages with heterosexualization with pride, with cricket star masculinity and beauty queens or cultural ambassadors who are called the cultural ambassadors. The state engages with them as with pride, while concerns with abjected sexualities under international pressures and engages with objective sexualities under international pressures and perceive these bodies as aberration, a problem, and fails to associate with them as human subjects despite the consistent expansion of civil society around the erotically marginalized publics. It took almost 2 decades for the Apex Court to India to bring erotically marginalized under the definition of legality after the painful struggle of LGBTQI collectives against the draconian law of Section 377 of Indian Penal Code. So the entry and visibility of non-heterosexual subjects operate within the very different register of disease and threat, while the classed heterosexuality via beauty pageants and sports were easily accepted and spectacularized as extravaganza through TV channels and corporate market sponsorship and consumer advertisements. Even after the recent legality gained by homoerotically inclined subjects, the LGBTQI plus communities, they may not offer any pride to the nation like beauty queens and cricket stars, despite the assimilation of certain queer subjects as consumer citizens in corporatized urban spaces, and also within the context of Sanatan Dharma. As you see, Hijra Akharas have come up. Here it is worth discussing what Ira Trivedi is. Now, I'm quoting here Ira Trivedi, who talks about sexual. So, I have talked about how the state engages in mediating and scripting sexual cultures in contemporary India, how state in collaboration with the Transnational Capital and Transnational Connection institute heterosexuality, reinscribes heterosexuality, and we experience a heterosexualization through cricket starred masculinity and beauty pageants in India. Simultaneously, this has to turn to the abjected marginals or sexually marginalized people because of the HIV/AIDS pandemic and because of the international pressure, but state never associate with these constituencies with pride. At state associate with the beauty pageants and cricket star masculinity with prides, nationalist pride. Now, something else is also happening in India, and Ira Trivedi talks about the role of technology as enabler in reorganizing and revolutionizing the sexual and intimate lives of urban middle class in India. Ira Trivedi addresses now we experience part of the sexual culture, emerging sexual culture, internet dating, premarital sex, pornography, and the emerging new class of sex workers. But she also talks about the fierce backlash against sexual access. As recently we have seen that there was a death in Pune city because of a Dalit boy wanted to had a relationship with an upper caste girl, and he was murdered recently. So there are also backlash against sexual access and assertion of patriarchal power in contemporary India. So it has opened up, but there are also problems. I quote her. She says that technology in particular has been a major game changer. Cable television, Facebook, Twitter, YouTube, chat rooms, online porn, and like have teased the imagination of young India, expanding her horizons and aspiration with a click of the button. I explored the apparent polarities, tradition and modernity, arranged marriage and internet dating, pornography and a deeply conservative attitude that seem to be present simultaneously in our society. Premarital sex in urban India is skyrocketing, an estimated 75% in 18 to 24 bracket. Sex is rampant in urban high school, and it is no longer unthinkable for 13-year-old to be dating. Sex is finally out of closet. On a short drive through urban India, one is bombarded with titillating sexual images of scantily clad women sucking on the popsicles in an ice cream ad, an actress spread eagled on a washing machine, or a couple on the verge of sexual congress in a deodorant ad. The same overt sexuality is present in Bollywood movies. Pornography is widely available. Indians are ranked number 6 in the world for online porn views. There is a flagrant gay party scene in the bars and bathhouses of metro cities. For gay men, sexual encounters are a click of button away. Sex for sale for both men and women easily available, including a new host of sex workers from Indian college girls to middle-aged housewives. And reputable five-star hotels across Indian cities are being used as modern-age harems. In many parts of India, sexual ideals and practices that are reminiscent of patriarchal and repressive past are upheld. There is a fierce backlash against sexual excess, and there is a growing tension between the old and the new. There is a dark underbelly of Indian sexual revolution. Baby girls and female fetuses continue to be killed, and sex ratio continue to plummet. Government documents explicitly say India does not need sex education. Sex education is always kept aside in India. The excerpt above hints at some unanticipated revelations about changes in the erotic landscape of urban India. But the question is whether this shift indicates towards a democratization of sexual and erotic, and if freedom from sexual violence is imminent even in the changing times. It appears that in the post internet pornographized context, the meaning of porn is still stuck in the realm of excess. There is a book called Cyber Sexy Rethinking Pornography, which raises this concern. The author writes to label something porn is to strip it of value and to place it outside accepted value system. Right from the first excavation of Pompeii to the newest digital avenues of desire, calling something porn means telling people who watch sexy content, who participate in sexy expression, and who produce sexy stuff that they lack values. Further, the question of power and consent remain crucial if the sexual revolution is not only about digital access of erotic and sexual contents, but also about digital consent. Digital access itself is divided between rich and poor, rural and urban, men and women, and among different classes of non conforming genders and sexuality. And hence, digital consent violation is not so uncommon. Elaborating on the gendered sexual aspects of violation and violence in digital realm, or what is also called technology facilitated sexual violence, uh, the, many authors write, irrespective of the gender of the victim, because boys and men can be of the victim of sexual violence as well, or the medium through which consent violations are committed, the thing that unites sexual violence online or offline is that the perpetrators are almost always men. Are the dating apps like Tinder and Grindr free from intimate intrusion and toxic technocultures, as well as from sexism, classism, casteism, and ageism? Uh, there are authors who dig deeper into some of these online spaces to suggest that there is a need to examine the ways certain design decisions and assumptions of use unintentionally enable or implicitly encourage these spaces to become hotbeds of misogynistic activism. The recent example of misogyny and online sexual violence surfaced from an Instagram chat room where 15 and 16-year-old boys from Delhi shared pictures of girls they knew and made sexually explicit and violent comments about them. So, how democratic is a sexual revolution in India should be a matter of serious debate and concern. Even queer digital spaces are not free from discrimination and stigma as effeminate subjects experience phobic remarks and abuse on queer dating apps. And you will find classism, casteism, sexism all circulating on queer dating apps. Now I turn to state, and I will give two of examples, and then I will sort of wind up. In this section, I outline the politics of state because state is a very crucial player in scripting and re-scripting and instituting certain sexual cultures in a given context, in a given historical time, or in a given society. So the politics of state through certain turning points in politicization of sexuality and mobilization against sexual violence and erotic justice in India, and the response of the Indian state towards politicization of sexuality in concrete terms. So people are politicizing. For example, we have Me Too movement, that is politicization of sexuality. But what is the sexual politics of the state? Whether states collaborates in instituting sexual freedom, or the state vacillates, or the states reinstitute misogyny, or what happens, that becomes very, very significant in instituting a kind of sexual culture which we have today. The state also governs and regulates sexuality to sustain the illusion that it is different from society. It is rational and it is indispensable for maintaining order. Then there are other actors like popular and public cultures and market. They also script sexual and erotic. Hmm. So I quote here Patricia Oberoi, who talks about. I quote here Purnima Mankekar, Raymond Williams, and Patricia Oberoi. They suggest that it is fallacious to conceive television technology distinct from social life. So television becomes very, very important. Popular culture becomes very, very important, highlighting the paradoxes constituting the politics of mass media and television. Patricia Oberoi writes, while the mass media embody and reproduce society's dominant ideology of class, race, and gender, they may also paradoxically serve as a means of escape from even resistance to these ideologies and valorization, or a space of intense struggle of resistance and conformity at once. So there are conformity and there are resistance also happening because of the mass media, because of the popular culture. I recently attended a webinar on asexuality, and I could discover that all these asexual people have discovered themselves through internet. They came to know certain terminologies, and these terminologies were very close to their own subjectivity, and through the description of this terminology on internet, they discovered that they match with it, and they come out to themselves, and then they form a collective of asexuals. So the mass media, social media are also important site of resistance, site of reshaping and rescripting sexuality, but they're also dangerous sites of reinforcing class, race, and gender ideologies. This is what is being highlighted. What is crucial from an erotic and sexual justice perspective is how a state which regulates sexuality is also unwilling to counter misogyny and sexual violence. So state is instituting lot of law, lot of protectionist rights for women, extending etc. etc. But a state also contradicts itself, and that contributes towards a sexual culture in a given context. I'll give certain examples of that. So, state is also unwilling to counter misogyny and sexual violence legitimized through popular and public culture, or it remains complicit in the misogyny either through indifference or endorsement. Even if I would say that state is indifferent to these misogynistic articulations in public culture and popular culture, then a state is complicit in the misogyny, state is complicit in the patriarchy. I reflect on the misogynistic film Kabir Singh and its phenomenal success in the box office, and the ethics of state constitutionally committed to gender justice. So there is a misogynistic film which is circulated through popular culture, the Indian cinema or the Bollywood, Hindi cinema, for example. But what is the responsibility of state, which is constitutionally committed to gender justice? Does the state which is committed to gender justice allow for making of such films just because they have a popular demand? So Kabir Singh is allowed to make because it has a popular demand. So whether the state will rescript the popular or the state will reinforce the popular. What is the duty of a state if the state is constitutionally committed to gender justice? When the director filmmaker Sandeep Reddy Vanga remarks in justification of the misogyny in the film, if you can't slap, if you can't touch your woman whenever you want, you can't kiss, I don't see the emotion there. So this is the director of the film, Sandeep Reddy Vanga. So it was made into Telugu. It's a remake of Telugu film called Arjun Reddy, right? So the director is Sandeep Reddy Vanga, and he remarks in justification of misogyny of the film, he's saying, and I repeat, I read it again. He says that if you can't slap a woman, if you can't touch your woman whenever you want, if you can't kiss, I don't see the emotion there. What is the responsibility of state, and who is called upon to contest this unfair and inegalitarian remark? Of course, the voices of dissent, the feminist and women's group, through their Twitter handle and Facebook post, and essays in magazines and newspapers, stick their neck out. But who is to check the popular demand for sexism, misogyny, and scopophilia of the majority and ensure that minority voices of dissent, feminist, and pro women get a fair hearing? So it's majoritarian, the popular demand of sexism, misogyny, and scopophilia. They are the popular demands. They are the majoritarian demands. But whether the state has to succumb to these majoritarian demands, This is something akin to our state has to side with the minority voices of dissent, feminists, pro-women, to give them a fair hearing, to institute a democratic sexual culture. What is the duty of state? This is something akin to upholding constitutional morality against public morality, which in Ambedkar's vision is not a natural sentiment but needs. So I am talking about constitutional morality and public morality. The public morality wants Kabir Singh, but the constitutional morality says that no, you have to censor Kabir Singh, right? Or you have to ask the directors to make certain movies which should not reinscribe misogynistic articulations so and toxic masculinity as they have happened in the Kabir Singh, even if they are on popular demand. So I'm quoting here Baba Sahib Ambedkar. This is something akin to upholding constitutional morality against public morality in Ambedkar's vision. And Ambedkar said that upholding the constitutional morality against public morality is not natural sentiment but need to be cultivated. So democratic sexual cultures need to be cultivated rather than it is given or it is just happened out of nothing. So it needs to be cultivated. Ambedkar was mindful of the fact that in the absence of constitutional morality, the operation of constitution, no matter how carefully written, tends to become arbitrary, erratic, and capricious. When a state fails to address misogyny in popular culture, here is a film. Do the filmmakers, directors, and states receive a substantial share of what Connell calls patriarchal dividend? So, Raven Connell is a scholar who talks about masculinity. She has written about patriarchy, and she has given this concept of patriarchal dividend, where all men benefits from patriarchy. So men is not a homogeneous category. Men are divided in caste, class, race, religion, gender, and different permutations and combination of all of these. But there is also in certain ways that all men are beneficiary of patriarchy in certain ways. So whether the state which is dominated by men and the filmdom which is also dominated by men, they all are benefited from this patriarchal dividend. Is the silence of state is due to tax money? So state get tax because it's a box office hit, and state will get tax money, and the director and producer will earn a lot of profit, and the protagonist will earn a lot of profit, prestige, and power. It seems pertinent to quote Lara Datta, the actor and entrepreneur and the winner of Miss Universe 2000 pageant, about the misogyny of Bollywood. She says, and I quote Lara Datta, who says, I have worked in what has been a misogynistic industry, and even now, the film industry remains hetero driven and male dominated. As women, you learn how to navigate that in your own way. The deluge of allegations of sexual harassment through Me Too movement in Bollywood, Tollywood, Mollywood, and Tamil cinema reinforces. So there are Me Too movement in all cinemas, all regional cinemas. Most of the regional cinemas also. It is in Bollywood, it is in Tollywood, it is in Mollywood, it is in Tamil cinema. They reinforce and even reveal much more about the entrenchment of patriarchy and misogyny in this setting and what the state is doing for that, whether the state is disturbing the misogynies in this context or the state is reinforcing the misogynies. I now talk about two things to understand how state is contributing towards a patriarchal and misogynistic sexual culture and how state is despite the sexual revolution which is coming in India. Simultaneously, we have toxic culture, toxic masculinity and misogyny and patriarchy is they are reasserting and reinstituting themselves. And it is a duty, it is incumbent upon the state to engage with those forces and try to create a democratic sexual culture. But that is not happening. The two things I engage with here and then end my talk is Delhi rape case of 2012 and Me Too movement in India. So you will see that the Delhi rape case, it happened on December 16, 2012, where Jyoti Singh, who was also given the name Nirvaya by the press. A 23-year-old physiotherapy student was brutally gang raped by six men in a bus in South Delhi. The severity of sexual assault and inadequate response of the Indian government to crime provoked a nationwide protest and demand for legal reform. While other rapes have prompted a public outcry, this particular case inspired an elevated interest not only in India but around the world. It has a global impact. Protesters urged rapid legislative reform as a tribute and insurance that no such event would happen again in India. Men participated very visibly in the protest. So this was a very unusual protest where you have men also participating in the movement against rape or protest against rape, offering a vital counter narrative to the construction of static Indian masculinity that actively resists disruption to traditional gender norms. Notwithstanding Dalit feminist critique around rape protest that the nation does not show similar solidarity when non-Savarna Dalit woman is raped. Ablina Sakil's essays pithily outlines the potential of this nationwide protest around Nirbhaya rape case in re-scripting and destabilizing the popular. So, what is happening through popular social protest movements? The social protest movement is pushing for reforms, is pushing for change in re-scripting and destabilizing popular narrative around gender. What is happening? But what the state is responding to? The state is responding in terms of diluting the Justice Verma Committee report. You see that because of this protest, Justice Verma Committee was instituted by the government of India. It needs to be highlighted here that government was compelled to institute Justice Verma Committee under pressure from public protest around the Delhi rape case. But the report, which was profound in terms of incorporating a transformative feminist agenda, was toned down by the government, converting it into an ordinance. It is worthwhile to list out the major shift in language and contents of protest and gains of Justice Verma Committee report based on certain reportings. So what was there? I read a quote from Ablina Sakil who writes, usually every incident of rape and molestation is followed by many advisories to women not to go out, to change the way they dress, to choose their company carefully, etc. In short, to accept a series of restrictions on their safety. This time, young students and women asserted their freedom proactively. The most powerful slogan on the street was "Mahilaएं मांगे आजादी, सड़क पे चलने की आजादी, रात में निकलने की आजादी, कुछ भी पहनने की आजादी, etc." Women demand freedom to walk on streets, to go out at night, to wear anything. Placards were equally expressive. नजर तुम्हारी बुरी चेहरा मैं छुपाऊं. You are one giving bad eye. Why should I hide my face? मेरी स्कर्ट से ऊंची मेरी आवाज है. My voice is higher than my expert. Men करे तो stud, मैं करूँ तो slut. If men do that, they are a stud. If I do that, I am a slut. Why? So Justice Verma Committee instituted by government in response to public received 80,000 submissions from concerned people wanting a change in rape laws to ensure gender justice. This was unprecedented in the history of democratization from a gender perspective. The Justice Verma Committee report held state responsible and accountable for the condition of women, their right to life, security and bodily integrity, democratic and civil rights, equality and non-discrimination, right to secure spaces, special provision for elderly and disabled women, and protection of women in distress. The committee also discussed patriarchal attitude of police, suggesting a thorough police reform where any oversight or apathy would invite action under law. The committee redefined rape from the viewpoint of women's experience, which is premised on their full bodily autonomy and integrity, taking within its purview the instances of marital rape. Consent was also redefined as the absence of unequivocal voluntary agreement so that passivity under shock or trauma was not constructed as consent. So if a woman is allowed herself to be raped under shock or under trauma or under certain insecurities, it will not amount to consent. So it was that radical, the Justice Verma Committee recommendations and reports. The committee also held that offences must become graver if committed by public servants and prescribed by the extra powers of Armed Forces Special Power Act, APSPA. This would be amended and the Khap Panchayats need to be curbed, proposing a constitutional body similar to Controller and Auditor General for a gender audit of the entire system. So you see, through a social movement, through a protest movement, what all were demanded, but state failed. The government's response at that time it was a Congress government, of course. So the government response in terms of Criminal Law Amendment Ordinance 2013 failed to incorporate these transformative contents of Justice Verma Committee report. It dropped marital rape, failed to address prescribed amendments of APSPA, Armed Forces Special Power Act, and remained silent on the rehabilitation of victims and survivors of rape. The language of outraging the modesty was also retained. The lack of willingness of state in owning responsibility and accountability. So the state has to own responsibility for the women victims and to accept some drastic amendments in law to create safer public spaces reflect that state remains patriarchal and masculinist despite its rhetoric of women's empowerment and gender justice. So you see how radical and how revolutionary was Justice Verma Committee recommendations, but the state toned it down and the state reasserted masculinist and patriarchal ethos in its modus operandi. It is pertinent to note here that Nirvaya Fund, there was a Nirvaya Fund which was collected and created to to make public spaces safer for women, right? So it is pertinent to note here that Nirvaya Fund created after the protest around Delhi gang rape to ensure the public safety for women has been highly underutilized, reflecting again the unwillingness of state to ensure gender justice. So, the Nirvaya Fund is also not even utilized. Only the 10 or 20% of the crores of money which is being utilized. Shows the unwillingness of the Congress government as well as the present ruling establishment to ensure gender justice. I will talk about Me Too. Of course, in the question answer, I will talk more about queer if you want. But I'm talking about Me Too movement now in India. So Me Too movement in India has been subjected to criticism on account of its elitism. Only elite women are raising their voices. It could neither transcend the class, caste, ability and sexuality divides, nor could percolate down to Dalit, Adivasi, disabled queer women. These are the critiques of Me Too movement. The significance of movement, I understand, however, might lie in revealing the intensity of sexism and sexual violence in elite normative domains, particularly the urban sophisticated elite workplace, right, which is the world of cinema. It exposed the fact that sexual harassment and academia, yeah, and journalism. It exposed the fact that sexual harassment is rampant among elites and the so-called progressive sections such as film directors, writers, professors, and many who sometimes pose as flag bearers of women empowerment and feminism. The pertinent question is, despite being elite and privileged and with definite socio-economic entitlements, where these women, so these women are elite, of course, privileged, of course, they have socio-economic entitlements, were these women able to contest the misogyny in their workplaces dominated by upper caste class cis men to safeguard their own interest, if not the interest of their subaltern sisters. So they are not able to safeguard the interest of their subaltern sisters. But are these women able to safeguard their own interest even if they are elite? It appears that these privileged women, with their cultural and linguistic capital and access to social, electronic, and print media, have been disabled by a system where privileged men exert a greater influence, and some of them have been easily bailed out by respective courts, obviously in the absence of sufficient evidence. I wish to argue that despite the honest, dishonest appropriation of feminism in various degrees and in different versions by law, media, market, corporate, state, judiciary, educational system, these institutions eventually remain phallocentric. And what is phallocentrism? Phallocentrism, which is centered around male phallus and safeguarded patriarchal interests as they are mostly dominated. So all these institutions, whether it is law, it is media, it is market, it is corporate, it is state, it is judiciary, it is educational system, all are dominated by men. In the context of masculine privilege articulating with race, caste, and class power, this category of men who are at the helm of business and corporate, managerial, and intellectual systems have been able to sustain a worldview of gender difference, reducing women to their corporeality or as the natural other of the men. So these women are natural other of these men in their understanding. This man then becomes this otherness then becomes an alibi for normalization of sexual stereotypes, sex-based discrimination. For example, an unquestioned justification for the low remuneration of Bollywood heroines vis-a-vis male superstars and the sexualization of women's body. So if you see, even if these stars are very, celebrities or whatever, they have reached the pinnacle of their career or peak of their careers, etc., etc. They are superstars, but still they are paid less than the male stars. Why they are paid? So that becomes a justification that women are different, they are other, and they are reduced to their bodies. Um, So there is an unquestioned justification for low remuneration of Bollywood heroines vis-a-vis male superstars and sexualization of their bodies. The workspaces then is rife with possibility of sexual assault and violence, where bosses who control their career prospects always invariably belong to influential class of cis men. These cis heteropatriarchal upper caste, upper class men are the privileged and they dominate all these spheres. The normalization of assault and violence in male-dominated system may partly justify the softness of police and judiciary in bailing these influential men out. So police also bail out these men. Judiciary also bail out these men, as well as the reason for elite women's time. So they understand each other because men dominate all these fields. So men understand each other's interest, right? So men are being bailed out by other men or masculinist system. The normalization of assault and violence in a male-dominated system may partly justify the softness of police and judiciary, which is also male-dominated, in bailing the influential men out, as well as the uh, reason for elite women's time lapse and inordinate delay in complaining and visibilizing. So these women are elite, but why there was so much of time lapse in complaining? Because they know that nothing is much is going to happen in this system. Karen Gabriel aptly submits that patriarchy has always hierarchized and divided men in terms of their privilege, but it also have fraternized and homogenized them. So she talks about homosociality. Homosociality is a concept which indicates where men interact among themselves. This is an all male space. So in the homosocial spaces, all men have certain fraternity and certain homogeneity. Homosociality permits individual men to draw on the power and violence of masculinity and its social meanings despite being themselves powerless. I bring in here two cases of Tanushree Datta and Priya Ramani to argue that even privileged women's accusation of sexual harassment against privileged class men can be difficult fight for these women. Datta blamed Nana Patekar of physically misbehaving with her while filming a dance sequence number for 2008 film Horn OK Please. When Tanushree Datta was performing a solo dance sequence, Nana Patekar went closer to make her feel uncomfortable. This is the report in Hindustan Times, and I'm quoting from there. Her opting out from the film and the dance sequence allegedly after Nana Patekar's unwanted moves was also followed by an attack on her car. So later on, her car was attacked but the Mumbai police was unable to find any clue about these hundreds of attackers amidst the availability of video clips. Tanushree Datta was slapped with a couple of defamation cases, and Nana Patekar was acquitted by Mumbai police, obviously due to lack of evidence against him. These unorganized sectors, which is filmdom is also an organized sector, probably are under no obligation to institute internal grievance redressal mechanism for addressing cases of sexual harassment at workplace as per the Visakha guidelines of Supreme Court of India. The point is, however, why would a sexual harassment in Bollywood fade away from memory after making national headlines? And why did Bollywood as an industry remain silent in showing their support to Tanushree Datta? So nobody is supporting Tanushree Datta, including Amitabh Bachchan. Priya Ramani and Amitabh Bachchan have become silent on all the issues now, except he coming from all the advertisements. Priya Ramani, through her Vogue article, she is a journalist, in 2017 and subsequently through Me Too movement in India, exposed MJ Akbar, the editor-in-chief of Asian Age. You can imagine how powerful this man is, and the junior external affairs minister in ruling BJP government of sexual harassment. Following this, several women journalists accused MJ Akbar of sexual misconduct. MJ Akbar, though resigned from his ministerial position following the allegations, filed a defamation suit against Ramani. He could hire the services of 97 lawyers to fight against 15 women. Though the matter is sub judice, one can see the might of the privileged man in developing legal attacks, in deploying legal privileged men in deploying legal attacks and dismissing the allegation of all 15 professional women. Ramani had to seek bail from court by producing a bond of 10,000. The procedure in the court will linger. The Indian media has already lost track with Me Too movement and the network that nothing much can happen in this evidence-obsessed court. In the absence of evidence, the defamation case might cost Ramani and not the accused. The secular court and judicial systems are not monolith in their handling of gendered violence, yet the privileged elite women of Me Too movement cannot outweigh the men of substance. By bringing their sexual assault in public and daring to speak against such powerful men, these women lose their delicate, ladylike, feminine respectability and protection worthiness, and probably would evoke no sympathy from male judges and police mercenaries. And I think I stop here. And in conclusion, I can only say that there are a lot of contradictory trends in contemporary India. On the one hand, what we witness through technology and technological advancements and use of technologies, you have sexual revolution, you have opening up of economy, you have transnational connections, you have lot of intimate spaces, online, offline, available to the urban Indians particularly. Of course, there is a divide, but there is also a reassertion of very, very conservative tendencies. You have intercaste marriages are discouraged, there are murders happening, the sex ratio is still unfavorable, and the role of state becomes very, very crucial. But the role of state, it institutes certain democratic freedom, like it has the Supreme Court has read down the section 377. The Supreme Court has come up with the Nalsa judgment of 2014. The court has given Visakha judgment, but at the same time, if you look at the modus operandi of court, the court is also contradictory at certain times. If you see Farooqi judgment, for example, where the question of consent which came up, and look at what kind of judgment of the court. A feeble no is not no, right? And if you go through the Justice Verma committee recommendations, the bodily integrity and autonomy of the woman, in what conditions he has said yes, right? So these are not important within the judicial parlance. And then you will see the popular culture. The state is allowing the popular culture, which is misogynistic. The state is vacillating, the state is half-hearted when it comes to accepting the recommendation of Justice Verma committee report and instituting, giving it, translating it in the form of a law and legislation and enforcing it also to make the public spaces safer for women. It is not happening. And if you look at the judiciary when it comes to Me Too movement, and if you look at the attitude of men, the ruling class men, the powerful men when it comes to Me Too movement, because mostly these powerful men are complicit in sexual harassment, so they are hostile to this Me Too movement, and the media has forgotten the story of Me Too movement. There can only be sexual culture, democratic sexual culture instituted through the intervention of media if there is a sustained campaign by the media, but media picks it up and media forgets it. So what will happen? So there is not a very hopeful picture of sexual cultures in contemporary India, though there is certain revolutionizing of sexual and erotic in contemporary India. So we have a mixed picture. We have a lot of disappointment from the state, which is a major and crucial actor in instituting sexual democracy and sexual citizenship in any nation state. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Professor Pushpesh Kumar. Professor Pushpesh Kumar is a renowned faculty from Department of Sociology, University of Hyderabad, and so we got a wonderful lecture. Audible to hello, hello. Yeah, I think I'm audible. So now what we can do, we can go to the audience for having couple of questions for discussing with. I got through chat box and WhatsApp group. So I will start with them at first. So the first question is from Somitria Chand. So their question is, so it seems sexual culture are irritatively immersed in misogyny and violence. So Professor, can you hear me?
Yeah, I can hear you. What is the question? Can you repeat the question?
Okay. So it seems sexual cultures are irritatively enmeshed in misogyny and violence. So, and the second
Um,
question, okay,
hmm.
sir.
Yeah, I agree and I also disagree to this because if you read lot of historians of sexuality, right? Even if you're starting from Foucault in the West, or if you look at Indian, South Asian historians of sexuality, particularly if you read Indrani Chatterjee, right? I was just reading Indrani Chatterjee. Look at his Gender, Slavery and Law in Colonial India or her many other writing. Then you will come to know that no, the sexual cultures were also democratic, right? She's talking about the early medieval subcontinental India was not a country or nation state in modern sense of the term, but she's talking about the subcontinent in medieval, early medieval times, 11th century, Kashmir, for example, and she's talking about monastic governmentality. Within that monastic governmentality, monastic systems, so India was divided into territorial units constituted in terms of land grants, teaching, learning, rituals, and many other things he's talking about, and in which the peoples who would give very good commentary on grammars and poetry, they will also give a very good commentary on Tritya Prakriti, men who are having third gender nature or Tritya Prakriti, third nature. And what is the advantage of having a lover of that man of Tritya Prakriti? That is also part of a sexual culture and which is not so misogynistic, right? So the most harm has been done by the colonial rule because colonialism was very misogynistic In that sense, colonialism was very, very patriarchal, colonialism was racist, colonialism was masculinist, colonialism was very violent and heteropatriarchal. So colonialism reinstituted misogyny and inscribed misogyny wherever it was not. So there was misogyny, but there was also something else. There was a coexistence. So there was no homoerotic person was. If you read Ruth Vanita and Salim Kidwai, for
Yeah,
example,
exactly.
there was no persecution of homoerotic people in pre-colonial India. There's no cases of persecution of homoerotic people in, and the naming of the sexuality itself comes after colonialism. The naming of the sexuality comes in the West after 17th century, where you are named as sodomite, and then that determines your whole personality. This naming and what Foucault calls scripting perversity into your body through naming, it comes in the West after 17th century, and then you know it is exported to the colonies by the metropole, by the colonial, through the colonial regime, through instituting law, and then this colonial morality or Victorian morality in certain ways was also internalized by social reformers in India. Till early 19th century or mid 19th century, you will see, if you look at ghazals, he's talking about ghazal. Salim Kidwai is talking about ghazals. I think all of you know ghazals, the Urdu erotic and love poetry. The Urdu erotic and love poetry were basically homoerotic till mid 19th century or even late 19th century. They become heterosexualized in late 19th century through Muslim reformism, because the Hindu reformers who internalized Victorian morality to a certain extent, they started looking at Muslims as homosexuals, Muslim as homoerotic. Then the Muslim reformers also went for heterosexualizing the ghazals. But before that, the ghazals talked about moon-faced man and many other things. So the poets were men, and they were talking about male beauty, right? Male sexuality. So I don't think that all sexual cultures have been always invariably misogynistic. We have to look at the history of sexuality, and sexuality always had a history. We think sexuality is eternal, timeless, and as a popular notion goes on, it is confined to individual and biology. It is not. Sex has a history. And if you look at the history, you will come to know sexual diversities, you come to know sexual oppression, you will come to know what was a gender flexibility, flexible norms. If you hear the story of Ayyappa, the birth of Ayyappa, for example, and what is happening. So I don't think it is misogynistic or invariably and always. Yeah.
So, sir, his other questions, it is from Priyam Ghosh.
Hmm.
Priyam has two questions for you.
Yes.
His first question is, how do you see the role of indigenization in highlighting gay men, MSM, and trans identity due to AIDS crisis, while queer women are left out as potential subjects due to their safe status? Do you think it reinstalls the Victorian morality that two women can't have sex?
Okay, the question is very long, but I will try to answer whatever I have understood. You reading out the question. So, NGOizations is asking about the person who is asking. What is the name? Can I know the name?
Priyam Ghosh.
Priyam Ghosh.
Yes.
Acha. So Priyam's question, that NGOization, yes, and I also said that how 1990s was also the time when there was a spread of HIV and AIDS, and that was coinciding with globalization and liberalization, the opening up of economy. That was the time of Manmohan Singh, and India was opening up, under certain circumstances to global economy. So on the one hand, The agenda is that they will ask you to go for the structural adjustment policies, like to cut on certain funds. For example, don't give that much subsidy to your farmers. So if you give subsidy to your farmers, then what will happen? Farmers will produce cheap. Then you will not buy wheat from America. So don't subsidize. So cut the subsidies through a structural adjustment policy, cut the funding on health, cut the funding on education, so that privatization will happen and foreign actors, capitalists will also invest in India. So then you are damaging Indian economy and particularly the marginal segment of society who will be damaged through privatization. But you are also showing your egalitarian teeth in Indian economy or in India through intervention. And through this humanitarianism, you are also trying to tell that India is a conservative country who has suppressed the sexual marginals, and we are the liberators. And India is also affected by the pandemic, right? Spread of HIV/AIDS, and then you also define India and third world as the geographies which are housing HIV/AIDS pandemic, and you intervene to reform it. So there is also a Western politics of establishing its moral hegemony while damaging your economy and also intervening through funding and creating. But of course, the unintended consequences of NGOization is that there is visibility, enormous visibility, which comes to certain segments of the sexual citizenry, which are the trans population, MSM, etc., etc. But there are a lot of stories of exploitation within these NGOs. These NGOs are managed by privileged class gay men, but all the workers who, and there's an essay by Alok Gupta, English Purki Kothi, in Gautam Bhan and Arvind Narayan's book. I forgot the title of the book. That is yeah. So because we have a voice, right? So because we have a voice, in this book there is an article by Alok Gupta which is called English Purki Kothi. And if you read, and you will see that these privileged class men who run this NGO will never go to railway station and hotspots to distribute condoms. Who will go? Always the Hijra people, the Kothi people will be sent to these hotspots to distribute condoms and do those kind of work, who are paid like 10,000, 8,000, 6,000, 5,000, whatever. And they also do sex work and dhandha to sustain themselves in the cities, right? But who are the beneficiary and the privileged people in these NGOs? The managerial class. And the managerial class is always belonging to certain privileged class of gay men. So there is a storage of lot of storage of exploitation which I have collected in Hyderabad city, of the trans women who have been working in the NGO, and what are their experiences. Many of these trans women have quitted their jobs from these NGOs, and they say sex work gives more autonomy, sex work gives more income, but now because of COVID-19 that has also gone, right? So I cannot paint a very romantic picture of this NGOization, right? And then NGOs also go by the agenda of donor and funding agency. So the funding agency is reduces the health of these MSM and transgender people to just HIV and AIDS. They embody HIV, they become the embodiment of HIV AIDS. And the whole target is on HIV AIDS, nothing else. Which is a good thing that HIV AIDS is being addressed. But you should not reduce them to targets of HIV AIDS intervention. They're much more than that, right? And there's a lot of frustration of the workers, the trans workers who work in these NGOs also. Yeah.
So, sir, there is another question from Priya,
Huh.
that is, uh, you respond to the move of queer community towards an assimilation culture, which largely attributes to heterosexist culture, and
Hmm.
how queer movement has staggered of from its path of and discriminalization in 2018.
Can you repeat? Your voice
Where
was
is
breaking.
okay, okay, sir. I already sent this question to you in chat box. So I am
Mm-hmm.
reading it again.
Mm-hmm.
How would you to the move of the queer community towards an assimilationist culture which actually attributes to heterosexist culture, and how queer movement has had off from its path post 377 in 2000.
Yeah, I think I have written one article also, Mapping Celebratory Moment. That is one article I published this year, and in which I am talking about how the privileged class of queer people, particularly the cis-normative gay men, right? If you see that how they are celebrating the reading down of Section 377, and if you look at the transgender leaders and transgender community members, how they were looking at these celebrations and what kind of skepticism they were expressing, because section reading down of Section 377 talked about, the sex in private. But most of these trans women who solicit customer in the public spaces. So what kind of celebration they will have of the privacy private if sex is liberalized within the private domain, because they are doing sex work in public spaces, so there is so much publicness of their embodiment and publicness of their profession, and how they will celebrate reading down of section 377 if it talks about privacy. So in many ways, the many of the trans women were critiquing the reading down of 377. And when the judgment was passed, the judges were talking about love and not sex. They were talking about love has own love, 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 and not sex, as if sex itself is a dirty word. But the trans women have to do sex work, right? And then there is a culture. Then you have Uber, the whole market. If you look at Make My Trip, Uber, all have become rainbow. The whole market and corporate became rainbow, and trying to titillate this privileged class of gay customers into consumption, right? Into the culture of consumption. And all these queer events, the drag shows, etc., are hosted in Bistro. I have discussed it in Hyderabad. So Bistro is organizing this queer show, and this Bistro was offering spaces for free, right? And then the expectation is that you buy food from the Bistro, food and beverages and drinks you buy from the Bistro. So the queer, the people among the queer who can buy and afford, they are benefiting the bistro, and in turn, bistro is providing a space. So if that is, and whereas you see majority of poor working class trans people and working class gay and working class lesbian community, which Maya Sharma talks about, which in Bombay this Labia group is talking about, in Sahyatrika, the Kerala, in Sahyatrika, the lesbian group is talking about the struggles, everyday struggles of the working class, queer people, queer women and men, and trans. If you see that is not being addressed. That's why I call about substantive justice. Where is the substantive justice? And if you look at the whole Nalsa judgment, how the state is vacillating, how the state is not translating it into the act. If you look at the act, how arbitrary it is. If you look at the rules which is now going to come up, how arbitrary it is. There is no substantive justice incorporated into the act by the state. So there is no substantive elements which will benefit the majority of queer. But definitely the privileged class of queer are assimilationist, as you have said. There was one article in Galaxy which says that there was a gay party organized in Delhi. We said poor people need not come in this party. Openly they have, written and announced that poor people should not enter into this gay party. So gay party has been happening since 1980s, which is not new. But what has it changed, right? There's a problem of class and how queer citizens are divided in terms of class, caste, race, ethnicity, etc., etc., disability, ability, cis and trans, and many other ways. So the state has to address and the queer movement has to address all these diversities and has to define the movement from the most marginalized segments of the queer community. Only then queer movement will be liberatory. Otherwise, as you said, it is assimilationness. And I definitely agree that privileged class of queer is definitely assimilationist as it enjoys and it has all the pleasure through a consumerist kind of culture, consuming through pub, consuming through club, going to bath houses, going to whatever, because you have money, sex tourism, and many other ways. But the questions of there are people who cannot live their communitarian life, and they have to be suppressed within the community lives. There are many Hijra people who are married, so they are Hijras in Bombay, but they come back to a small town and their rural areas, they are men. What is their life if there is no sex work now, right? So we have to think to democratize a movement, to democratize an ism, we have to think of from the perspectives of the most marginalized, diverse segments of the population, which the state is not doing, but the movement has to do. Movement has to put a pressure on the state to bring in substantive elements within the Transgender Act. So transgenders are fighting their battle alone. I don't think privileged class gay men are voicing with the transgender people, right? And incorporating that in the queer movement, right? And putting a pressure on the state to do that. So there is a division, and the trans people are frustrated. Again, privilege within the trans, now assimilated into the Hindu Sanatan Dharma culture, right? There is a Hindu queer group on Facebook I've seen, so
Yeah,
all
All
kinds
India
of
Hindu Alliance, Queer Alliance, like this.
yeah, yeah, definitely, definitely. Yeah.
So there is other question. They are talking about a space. In a space where is cis hetero male dominated even intersectionally, can we say that the phenomenon of social media trial does to an extent destabilize the apparent hegemony of institutionalized patriarchy?
Can you repeat the beginning of the question?
Okay. Again, in a
Only the
space
beginning.
where in
In
a
a
space
space?
in a space where is cis hetero male dominated, even institutionally, can we
Yeah.
say that the phenomenon of social media trial does to an extent destabilize the apparent hegemony of institutionalized patriarchy?
I can say both yes and no. Definitely, there are. If you look at the dating apps and many websites, if you see that there are many effeminate men, or there are many trans people who are saying I'm a bitch or I'm something, or there's an assertion and celebration of the body, right? So that is a kind of posing a question and a challenge to the heteronorm, right?
Yeah.
And there is simultaneously you will see that there is a hatred, there is a phobia articulated on these spaces, right? On these online spaces, even against no feminine, no girlies, no something. So there's a body shaming happening, and then if you can, they write in English, if you can hold a conversation, only then you talk, right? You talk if you can hold a conversation. Means looking for the people from the same class, right? English speaking, bourgeois, privileged, right? So I have in my paper I have just quoted from some profile which is say speak English, dress Italian, something spend Arab, party Caribbean. This is the profile is saying, right? And this person is saying, talk to me, ping me only if you can hold a conversation. So this person is saying, if you belong to my class, only then you talk to me. So what kind of toxicity what kind of exclusionary articulations you will also find there. So there is also assertions and celebrations of diversity of body. So there is a contestatory politics being played out, but there is also a very hegemonic, a very cis privilege, cis normative and class privilege, which is also at play in these spaces.
Tapash Dash, can you mute yourself? Tapash Dash, can you mute yourself? Uh, Tapash Dash, can you mute yourself? Yeah. So, sir, then again, yeah, you're completely right. We can see these kind of misfunctions or misphenomenon in lots of dating apps. Not only class and there is caste issues also. Like I am from
Caste issue
Brahmin,
also,
so
yes.
Brahmins only,
Yes.
Jat only in North India. Have
Yeah.
seen these things. Not only that, ethnicity also, no Northeast so called. So this kind of statement is there in dating apps and dating medias also. And there is another question that is regarding, I think, caste. So, how does homosexuality function exactly when lower caste men are more like to be convicted of crimes than upper caste men? How is there male complexity in such a hierarchical system? Why would lower caste men comply with such an unfair system?
See, now in contemporary India, it is no more illegal. It is only illegal in the public places, right? So who does all this in public places? The lower caste men are of course lower class, right? And they don't have luxury of space if they are homoerotically inclined. They don't have luxury of space, right? They don't have privacy of homes in which they will do these acts. So if they do in public, still they can be caught by the police, and police can put them behind the bar. So the conviction of lower class men will definitely be much more, right? So if you are a drag queen, and white and English speaking and privileged, you can be part of the very elite gay subculture. But if you are a black working class drag queen, there are a lot of writings on black drag queens, and there are a lot of black trans women who are murdered. Why? Because of their racial disadvantage. So here also there are many lower class men, caste men, who are also lower class men who cannot afford the luxury and privacy of homes, right? And they might do certain things in public places, and they might be caught by the police and convicted. Logic is same. There is a caste, there is a class. So there is an embeddedness of caste, class, race, and ability, disability, everything in sexuality. So sexuality cannot be isolated and and seen in isolation, but it has to be seen in connection with all these inequalities and privileges. Of course, yeah.
Sir, there is another part. Also, how do you discuss states' complicity and coordination without centering it always with this understanding of women? Because state imagines men and women with limited understanding. Is there not glorification of Me Too makes us complicit with the criminal act of erasing voices of Dalit and trans women? How does this complexity is different from a state's complicity in erasing does not that ask for radical gender and erotic justice? Question bhai Biraja.
I think I fully agree with with what the person is asking. Definitely, the Me Too movement is not associating with Dalit women, Adivasi women, disabled women, trans women. It is a voice of privileged women, definitely. But even these privileged women are disprivileged if you compare with the whole misogynistic, patriarchal, heteronormative system in which these women also cannot get justice. If they cannot get justice, then what do you think of other disprivileged classes of women? Because I'm arguing in this paper that all these corporate, business, Bollywood, filmdom, media, houses, politics, educational institutions, all are dominated by cis heteronormative privileged class men, upper caste men. There is an article in EPW. I can send you that article, which did a survey. A survey was carried out of corporate houses and who all are in managerial positions. So all the stakeholders at managerial positions, they are from upper caste and mostly men. So the corporate is dominated by men. Do you think these men to do justice to the women, to these women, even if they are coming from certain privileged background, right? They will safeguard their own interest. Similarly, Bollywood, right? Bollywood is dominated by, I've quoted from Lara Datta, who is saying how it is hetero and male dominated space, right? And similarly, and I have also said homosociality, there's certain bond which all these men have, privileged class men particularly have, is a male bonding, a homosociality. They want to help each other. They all have internalized certain misogyny, right? And they have not been able to overcome misogyny despite their education, despite the education of law itself is not so liberatory, right? The law itself is very, very heteropatriarchal, right? The language itself is very, very heteropatriarchal. And when it is combined with your cis privilege, your caste privilege, your class privilege, etc., you are not ready to leave it so easily, right? Only a very strong social movement can attack on these privileges and can institute democracy. And whatever democracy we have because of this protest culture and protest movements of people. Right. So I agree that Me Too movement is not associating with disability, disabled women, trans women, Dalit women. It is exclusionary. It comes with certain cis privilege and certain these women are privileged in terms of linguistic capital. They can speak very good English, cultural capital. They are connected. So even if they have linguistic and cultural capital, right, and economic capital, they are quite defeated and disprivileged vis-a-vis these privileged men. So even within the privileged, there is a gender,
Hmm.
and these women are disprivileged because of their gender, right?
Absolutely right.
And located in a system which is very, very phallocentric, I have said, which centers around a phallus, male sexual organ. It's a very phallocentric economy, society, polity, etc.
Yeah. Even in sex or male sex workers getting higher pay than the female sex workers, it is also very much is there in our heteropatriarchal society. So there is one more question from the audience, that is, uh, this this is a reheterical argument. What does it achieve? Yes, the count the counters of discriminalization are within private space, but what are the implications of the critique? Discriminalization of sexual acts in public view. Uh, Again, I am
So
repeating.
the yeah
Yes, sir. Yes, sir.
yeah. Can you repeat the question?
Okay, okay. This is a this is a heterocal argument. What does it achieve? Yes, the contours of decriminalization are within private space, but what are the implications of critique? Discriminalization of sexual acts in public view.
Yeah, the person who's asking question is saying that it is a rhetoric, and also some many things are happening in public spaces and not in private spaces. But if you look at, I have talked about the Justice Verma Committee report.
Mhm.
So this was an incident of rape in the public space, right, in Delhi. It happened in the public space. It happened in a running bus, which is a public transport, right? So it is happening in a public space. And Justice Verma Committee report, if you read, it talks about all protectionist and safety measures to be instituted in the public spaces, with police, with hospital, with other kinds of, with the streets have to be lit in the night, full of teams or something, or numbers for women to call in crisis, and many other things. It is about public spaces, and state has to own the responsibility of the victim. State had to rehabilitate the person who is a victim of violence, sexual violence. All these things are there, but state has not incorporated. This is about public. This is not about private, right? This is about public places have to be made safer for women. And there is a book by I forgot the author, Silpa Phadke, which talks about why loiter. So loitering is an act which men mostly do, right? Loitering around here and there in the night, in the midnight, wherever they want to go. So Silpa Phadke and many feminists are saying, even the queer people are saying, unless and until you claim the night
Hmm.
vis-a-vis the men, at par with men, there is no sexual freedom at all. So night is always fearful, frightening for certain constituencies to walk in the night. So she's saying all have to walk. How all will walk if the roads and public places are safe? How the public places will be safe if the state is investing to make the public spaces safe? Because people cannot make public spaces safe. It is the responsibility of the state to make public spaces safer, to make half of the citizens who are women and many percentage of citizens which are non-conforming gender and sexualities to walk freely as men walk freely. Not all classes of men, of course, but most of the classes of men walk freely on the roads, right? So similarly, if all sexualities and genders walk freely on the road in the night and claim the night equally, so in that context, I'm saying that Justice Verma Committee report is very, very important because it talks about public safety, ensuring public safety in universities, colleges, streets, etc., etc. But the state is not incorporating. And in the neoliberal times, the space is, the state is very much fond of responsibilizing people themselves rather than kind of, taking and owning responsibility. So state will say, stay safe, stay safe, stay safe to the women, to the people who are vulnerable, but state will not institute safety because it requires money. And when you are privatizing everything, you are spending less on public safety, and public expenditure is reduced day by day. How you will ensure safety to the vulnerable sections of the population? So there is a dilemma, there is a contradictions in the neoliberal state, and which Wendy Brown in her book, Wendy Brown's book, I'm forgetting the name, something against the demos is the title of the book. She talks about the dilemmas of neoliberal state, where democracy itself is marketized, right? Self-help is the best help. This is the slogan of the state. So you come in a group, you collect money, you help yourself. State will not do anything, right? So this is the problem with the neoliberal state, and it is not private, but there are concerns of public safety. There are concerns of safety and security in the public. There are articulation through certain committee reports and movements that states should own the responsibility, but state is not ready to own the responsibility. It is toning down the recommendations, and it is asking the people, it is responsibilizing the people to help themselves.
Uh,
So a very
the-
strong political movement can only help, in my understanding. Yeah.
there is another question from Biplab Karak. I will I would like to ask Biplab Karak to unmute. Biplab, then ask your question directly. It is a wonderful question, a long question. So that's why I'm asking Biplab. Please unmute yourself.
Hello, am I audible now?
Yes.
Yeah, thank you, Professor, for the edifying lecture. Uh, my question is related to one point that you made in the course of the lecture. You said that mass media plays a very important role in shaping and reshaping the entire generation, right? In general, and particularly about sexual identities. So my question is like, uh, as we know that mass media also profits from this system of uh, it is called uh, you know I'm just falling short of words. I don't know, like capitalism, right? It is also profiting from capitalism, and which is in turn rooted deeply in the acts of depriving an inordinate amount of population uh, of many of their basic rights. So, if we just consider this particular scenario, can we really say that mass media would ever be able to help us or the queer community in finding ourselves the kind of voice that we always needed, right? So this is one question, and another question was um, about hello.
Yeah.
Yeah, another question was about uh, uh, you know uh, even within the queer community, the political maneuver of aristocracy and meritocracy works, right? So how exactly it is shaping the queer community, and what sort of repercussion it is foreseen to bring on itself as a community? So these are my two questions. Thank you, sir.
Yeah, definitely. Very well said. That I'm saying that there is a nexus between capitalism and mass media, and you know I do agree that and then capitalism has its own agenda, so there is always a limit to the freedom which will be offered through and by the mass media. That is important, but I was also talking about in the context of social media, right? For example, if you look at the whole trans movement which is happening across India, and social media is playing a very important role in the mobilization of trans constituency throughout the India through Twitter storm, right? They are talking about no to trans bill or no to something, and putting a tremendous pressure on the government. So whatever little modifications have happened in the transgender act, for example, the transgender have not to go to screening committee, for example, right? Earlier there was a provision of screening committee that their body will be screened if they want to claim a particular identity, but that has gone from that has been dropped from the trans bill, right? They are now trying to incorporate certain reservation provisions within the transgender rules. It is not there in the act, but within the rules they want to offer certain. It is also because of the trans constituencies are connected to social media throughout the India. So that is also happening, and as I said that there is a group of collective of asexuals who have discovered themselves through internet, right? Because they come across certain terminology, certain groups, certain collective, and they realize that they are not the only one, and they form a constituency who are the most invisibilized groups and constituency within the queer. So I think it is hegemonic. The mass media is very hegemonic. It reinforces caste, it reinforces class, it reinforces races, gender, sexualities, everything, and it is always in collaboration with the hegemonic state agenda. Right. But also there is an alternative possibilities which is created through social media. I will not say that mainstream mass media like television and all, but through social media, I was trying to say that it can create alternative possibilities. The second question, can you repeat? I hope to answer your question. What is the second question?
Yeah, can you hear me?
Yeah.
Yeah, okay. So the second question was about the political maneuvers of aristocracy and meritocracy which is being exercised within the queer community, and how it is influencing the shape that it is about to take in the days to come, right?
Definitely,
Hello.
I agree to what you're saying.
Yeah.
I definitely agree to what you're saying that there is a hegemonic tendency within the queer movement, right? There was an advertisement in Times of India a few years back where the mother of a gay, this person is a gay icon or whatever in Bombay, and the advertisement says that they want a higher husband for her son in the parenthesis. So there is this person is so privileged and this person's mother is advertising in the Times of India. So the advertisement for a gay matrimony itself is a very radical thing in Indian context. But again there is a question of caste which is there. So how these privileged classes of gay constituency, cis-normative gay men, play out in different domains, in different fields, and try to dominate the queer movement is very much true. It is the onus is the disprivileged people to question this hegemony, to question this consistently question this hegemony, and I think trans if you read my article in 2017, I wrote one article which is on transgender movement. It is changing face of queer movement in Hyderabad city, where how trans voices have become very dominant in Hyderabad queer movement, right? And trans critiques have criticized the hegemonic tendencies of the queer movement, and they have forced alliances with Dalit feminists, disabled groups, and many other constituencies, right? And then have tried to radicalize queer movement in India. So hegemonic tendencies are definitely there. If you look at the academia, the queer academia, if you look at how certain privileged class of you're from Bengal,
Yeah, I'm from Bengal.
Bengali men, if you see, and they forge a network, write, publish, quote, and cite each other, right? And only connect to those people. Outside the circles, they don't want to connect. They only connect when they have funding and they have to carry out a research on disprivileged people, write, publish, and get certain credit and credibilities out of these publications. So you are very much right. It is happening within the queer community, within the queer constituency itself, which the critique has to emerge from within and have to ask these questions, consistently raise this question within the queer movement. I think the disability
Okay, so
question
there
has
is
not.
another last question.
Yeah.
Any more questions? There is last question is there, that is from Sumitra Chand, and they post that in contemporary cultures in India post 1990s, is there time yet to discuss BDSM kinky subcultures?
I couldn't get the question properly. Can you repeat?
Uh, uh, the question is, in contemporary cultures in India post 1990s, time yet to discuss BDSM kinky subcultures?
Kinky and BDSM.
Yes, sir. Yes, sir.
I have not much idea about that, so I will not be in a position to answer this question. Uh,
So there is, I think, no more questions left. So
huh.
it was such a wonderful. Hello, who is there? It was such a wonderful session that we had with you. Thank you, Pushpesh Kumar sir, for being with us and give you such a wonderful lecture. And I am thanking to ICA that ICA give us this platform to organize a national webinar on gender, sexuality, and queer issues in India. And I am thankful to the organizer, the founder of ICA, Meghna Mehra, and all my organizing committee also, and to all the panelists and to Pushpesh sir for today's lecture. I'm thankful to Pushpesh sir. And now I think we should end here. If there is not anything, then we can end it here.
Thank you.
I think there is no more courses, so we can end it here. Thank you, sir, for being with us. Thank you, sir, for giving us a wonderful lecture. And I
Thank
have
you.
more questions, and I'll ask you through phone call also.
Sure.
Okay, sir.
Thank you. Yeah. Bye.
Bye.